For years, Mark had lived in his suburban home without any trouble. It was the kind of neighborhood where kids rode their bikes until sunset, where the smell of weekend barbecues filled the air, and where neighbors waved as they passed each other. His house, a modest but well-maintained two-story with a warm brick exterior, had always blended perfectly with the community. Nothing seemed out of place, until the letter arrived. One crisp morning, as Mark sipped his coffee on the porch, he noticed a neatly folded paper tucked under his door. At first, he thought it was just another neighborhood flyer, but when he unfolded it, his stomach tightened. A formal notice from the HOA. The words were blunt and unapologetic. Your home's exterior is not in compliance with community aesthetics. Repaint your house within 30 days to avoid penalties. Mark furrowed his brow. What? His house hadn't changed in years. He had never received a single complaint before. Why now? Confused, he walked around his home, scanning every inch. The paint was slightly weathered, but nothing out of the ordinary. His neighbors' homes had the same wear and tear, yet none of them seemed to have received notices. His thoughts spiraled. Was this some kind of mistake? Or worse, was he being targeted? Shaking off his unease, he decided to clarify the issue with the HOA. Maybe it was just a routine enforcement. Nothing personal. But something about the way the letter was worded made his gut churn. As he reread the notice, a strange feeling settled over him. This was just the beginning of something bigger. He just didn't know it yet. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Alright, let's keep going. Mark wasn't the type to let things slide. If something didn't make sense, he had to get to the bottom of it. And this HOA notice? It made no sense at all. Standing in his driveway, he glanced at the other houses on his street. Some of them had peeling paint. Others had visible cracks on their exteriors, yet none of them had a violation notice taped to their doors. Why was he the only one being singled out? Determined to get answers, he decided to start with his neighbors. His first stop was Mrs. Carter, the sweet old lady next door who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. When he asked if she'd ever received a notice like his, she shook her head, her brow furrowing. "Not in the 20 years I've been here," she said. "And your house looks just fine, Mark. This doesn't add up." That only deepened his suspicion. He moved on to Mr. Jenkins, the retired veteran across the street. Jenkins had a house with faded blue paint, clearly in worse shape than Mark's, yet he shrugged when asked about the HOA. "Never had a problem," he said. "HOA leaves me alone. Maybe they just don't like you." His words were meant as a joke, but something about them felt eerily close to the truth. Mark spent the rest of the afternoon knocking on doors, asking questions. The pattern became clear. The HOA's rules weren't just unclear, they were being enforced selectively. Some neighbors had been in blatant violation of HOA guidelines for years with no consequences, while others had been fined for ridiculous infractions. It wasn't about maintaining the neighborhood. It was about control. His frustration boiled over. This wasn't just an innocent oversight. Something shady was going on. The more he dug, the more convinced he became that this was personal. But who was behind it? And more importantly, why him? That was the question he intended to answer next. Mark didn't waste any time. The next morning, he walked straight into the HOA office, clutching the violation notice in his hand like a smoking gun. The receptionist barely looked up as he approached. "I need to speak with someone about this," he said, sliding the paper. Across the desk, she sighed, took one glance at it, and gestured toward a door down the hall. "You'll want to speak with Mr. Reynolds," she said flatly. "He's the HOA president." Mark had heard the name before. Reynolds was a smug, suit-wearing bureaucrat who rarely interacted with the neighborhood unless there was money involved. Mark squared his shoulders, knocked once, and then pushed the door open. Inside, Reynolds sat behind an oversized mahogany desk, flipping through a stack of paperwork. He barely acknowledged Mark's presence before gesturing toward a chair. "Mr. Thompson," he said smoothly, "what can I do for you?" Mark tossed the letter onto the desk. "You can start by explaining why I'm being forced to repaint my house when half the neighborhood is in worse condition." Reynolds didn't even flinch. Instead, he picked up the notice, skimmed it, and nodded. Your house's exterior does not meet HOA standards. It's clearly stated in the guidelines. Mark folded his arms. Show me where, because I've read those guidelines, and there's nothing about my house color being out of compliance. Reynolds gave him a tight-lipped smile, the kind that screamed condescension. We have discretionary authority to enforce aesthetic cohesion within the community. Your house, as it stands, is not cohesive. Mark's jaw tightened. That's just a fancy way of saying you make up the rules as you go. At that, Reynolds finally set his paperwork down. He leaned back in his chair, studying Mark like a school principal dealing with an unruly student. Look, Mr. Thompson, he said, his tone dripping with forced patience. The HOA's job is to maintain property values. If we let one house slide, soon the whole neighborhood starts to decline. We're simply ensuring that doesn't happen. Mark felt his fists clench. So why hasn't Jenkins across the street gotten a notice? His house looks like it hasn't been painted in a decade. Reynolds sighed dramatically. We address violations as they come to our attention. Perhaps his will be next. Mark wasn't buying it. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, his frustration bubbling over. This is bullshit and you know it, he snapped. You're targeting me for a reason. So why don't you tell me what's really going on? Reynolds' expression darkened, his patience wearing thin. Mr. Thompson, if you refuse to comply, you'll be fined. If you continue to resist, legal action will follow. I'd strongly advise you to simply follow the rules. Mark leaned in, planting his hands on the desk. And I'd strongly advise you to watch who you try to bully. I'm not some pushover you can shake down. For a split second, something flickered in Reynolds' eyes. Annoyance? Amusement? A challenge? Whatever it was, it told Mark one thing. This was personal. Reynolds leaned forward, lowering his voice to a whisper. You really want to fight this, Thompson? Be my guest. But trust me, you won't win. Mark stared him down, his pulse pounding in his ears. He wasn't sure what game Reynolds was playing, but one thing was clear. This was far from over. As he walked out of the office, he knew one thing for sure. He was going to find out exactly what Reynolds was hiding. And when he did, there'd be hell to pay. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Reynolds wasn't just enforcing the rules, he was choosing who had to follow them. The smug look on his face during their meeting wasn't one of a man upholding community standards. It was the look of someone who knew he had power and enjoyed wielding it. Mark wasn't about to let that slide. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were going to get one. That night, he pulled out his laptop and started digging. First, he scoured the HOA's publicly available documents, looking for anything unusual. Meeting minutes, policy changes, financial records. Anything that could hint at an ulterior motive. At first, everything seemed standard, filled with legal jargon and bureaucratic nonsense. But then he stumbled across something that made his stomach tighten. A list of HOA-approved home renovations. At first glance, it looked normal. Just a record of homeowners who had applied for exterior changes. But as he scrolled through, a pattern emerged. Some requests had been approved within days, while others had been delayed or outright denied for vague reasons. The biggest red flag? Every single approved request had one thing in common: connections to someone on the HOA board. Mark leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. This wasn't just selective rule enforcement. This was favoritism. But why? He needed more. He needed proof. Over the next few days, he started talking to people who had gone up against the HOA before. Most were reluctant to speak at first. Nobody wanted to anger the people who could find them into oblivion. But after some persistence, he found someone willing to talk, a former resident named Dave, who had moved out a year ago under mysterious circumstances. They met at a coffee shop outside the neighborhood. Dave was cautious, glancing around like he expected someone to be listening. You're not the first person to question the HOA, he said, but you better be careful, man. These guys don't play fair. Mark pressed him for details, and what he heard made his blood run cold. According to Dave, the HOA had been running a pay-to-play scheme for years. If you wanted to make changes to your home without hassle, you had to donate to a certain discretionary fund controlled by the board. Those who paid got their approvals fast. Those who didn't? They got notices, fines, and legal threats until they either complied or moved out. Mark clenched his fists. So that was it. Reynolds and his cronies were using their authority to shake down homeowners, making them jump through hoops unless they paid up. His notice wasn't about aesthetics. It was a shakedown. And judging by Dave's tone, this was just the tip of the iceberg. Then came the final bombshell. "You know who paid up big last year?" Dave asked. "Your next-door neighbor." Mark frowned. "Mrs. Carter?" Dave shook his head. "No, the guy who lived there before her. And you know what else? His notice? Same as yours." The words hit Mark like a freight train. This wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck. The HOA was targeting his house on purpose. Mark didn't know why, but one thing was clear. He was going to find out. And when he did, the whole neighborhood was going to know the truth. Mark wasn't just angry. He was determined. The HOA had been running their scam for years, bullying homeowners into compliance while lining their own pockets. But now, they had messed with the wrong guy. If Reynolds thought Mark was going to roll over and accept this, he had another thing coming. The first step was gathering evidence. Over the next few days, Mark documented everything. He compiled a list of homeowners who had received suspicious fines, took photos of houses that were clearly in violation but had never been cited, and printed out the HOA's approval records showing their blatant favoritism. He even recorded a follow-up conversation with Dave, the former homeowner, who confirmed, on tape, how the HOA had strong-armed him into moving out. But Mark knew he couldn't take them down alone. If he was going to win this fight, he needed allies. His first move was reaching out to the neighbors who had been wronged. Some were hesitant at first, afraid of retaliation. The HOA had a reputation for making people's lives miserable when they stepped out of line. But the more people Mark spoke to, the more the tide started to turn. The quiet whispers of, "This happened to me too," turned into, "Enough is enough." Within days, he had a group of frustrated homeowners ready to take a stand. Then came his ace in the hole, a legal expert. One of his neighbors, Sarah, happened to be a real estate attorney with years of experience dealing with shady HOAs. When Mark laid out his evidence, she shook her head in disgust. "This isn't just unethical," she said. "It's illegal." With Sarah's guidance, Mark put together a formal complaint against the HOA, detailing their history of extortion, selective enforcement, and financial misconduct. But before filing it, he wanted to do something that would really make Reynolds squirm. He wanted to make it public. Using his growing network of neighbors, Mark organized a community meeting. No HOA board, no interference, just homeowners getting the truth. Word spread fast. People who had stayed silent for years were suddenly eager to share their own horror stories. By the night of the meeting, more than 40 people showed up. Mark stood at the front, looking at the crowd of frustrated, fed-up homeowners. He took a deep breath and began. "For years, we've been told this HOA exists to protect property values." He held up a stack of documents. But what they're really protecting, their own interests. He laid out the scam, showing the proof: favoritism, backroom deals, bogus fines. The room buzzed with outrage. People started yelling, sharing their own experiences. And just like that, the HOA's carefully maintained illusion shattered. But Mark knew it wouldn't be that easy. The very next morning, an official letter arrived at his doorstep. Another fine, this time for disruptive behavior and failure to comply with HOA meeting procedures. And the kicker? A formal warning of potential legal action. Mark smirked. They were scared, and if they thought they could intimidate him, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Because he wasn't backing down. He was just getting started. The night of the biggest community meeting in years had finally arrived. Mark stood at the front of the packed clubhouse, staring at the sea of frustrated homeowners. The tension in the air was thick. The HOA board sat on the other side of the room, their usual smug confidence replaced with something else. Unease. They knew what was coming. They just didn't know how bad it would be. Mark cleared his throat, his voice steady. "I called this meeting because enough is enough. We've all had our fair share of problems with the HOA, but what if I told you those problems weren't random? That the rules we've been following for years weren't about keeping the neighborhood nice, but about making money for a select few?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mark could see heads nodding. He had their attention. He reached into his bag and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "I have proof," he said, holding them up. "Proof that this board has been running a pay-to-play scheme for years. If you wanted to get approval for a renovation, you had to donate to a certain fund. If you didn't, you got fines. Legal threats, harassment." The room erupted. People turned to each other, voices overlapping in disbelief and anger. From the front row, Reynolds, the HOA president, raised a hand, trying to regain control. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced with barely concealed panic. "This is nonsense," he said, forcing a laugh. "Mr. Thompson is clearly upset about his violation notice and is now resorting to wild accusations." Mark cut him off. "Wild accusations? Then explain this." He stepped forward and handed copies of the approval records to the nearest homeowners, who passed them around. "These show every exterior change approved by the HOA in the last 5 years. Look at the timestamps. Certain homeowners got approvals in days, the ones with connections to the board. The rest? Delayed for months or denied altogether." Gasps filled the room. Some people looked down at the papers in their hands, realization dawning on their faces. One man in the back stood up. "Wait, that's why my request to fix my porch took a year to get approved? But my neighbor, who's friends with the treasurer, got theirs in 2 weeks." Mark nodded. "Exactly." Reynolds shifted in his seat, eyes darting to his fellow board members. One of them, a woman named Janet, looked visibly nervous. But Mark wasn't done yet. "And then there's this." He pulled out his final piece of evidence. A recorded conversation. He tapped his phone, and Dave's voice, the former homeowner Reynolds had forced out, filled the room. "They gave me 2 choices," Dave's voice said. "Pay up and let them help with my renovation approval, or keep fighting and watch the fines pile up until I had no choice but to leave." Silence. Then, chaos. Shouts erupted from all corners of the room. Homeowners who had been quiet for years were furious. Some started hurling accusations at Reynolds and the board. Others demanded their money back. Reynolds' face had turned to a deep shade of red. "This is all circumstantial," he snapped, his voice cracking under the weight of the room's hostility. "There's no proof of wrongdoing. The HOA has every right to enforce its policies." That was when Mark delivered his final blow. "You're right. There's no proof, unless we audit the HOA's financials." The room fell dead silent. Reynolds froze. His board members exchanged panicked glances. Everyone knew what that meant. If there was an audit, the money trail would lead straight to them. That was when the first board member cracked. Janet, who had been looking uneasy since the meeting started, stood up suddenly. I can't do this," she muttered. "He's right. We've been approving requests unfairly. There's money involved. I tried to speak up before, but I was shut down." She turned to Reynolds, her voice shaking. "You said nobody would ever find out." The room exploded again, but this time all the anger was directed at Reynolds. Reynolds slammed his fists on the table. "This meeting is over," he barked. "None of this is legal. You can't just—" "You're done, Reynolds," Mark said, cutting him off. "We're filing an official complaint with the state's housing authority. You're going to answer for this." And just like that, the walls came crashing down. As Reynolds stormed out of the room, followed by his now former allies, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: victory. The battle wasn't over yet. There were still legal steps to take, and the HOA's corrupt practices needed to be formally dismantled. But for the first time, the homeowners weren't afraid. They had won the first fight, and Reynolds, his days of unchecked power were over. The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with what had happened. At the meeting, Mark's phone was flooded with messages, neighbors thanking him, others offering more evidence against the HOA, and even a few local reporters sniffing around the scandal. But the real fireworks started when Sarah, the attorney, filed the official complaint. Within days, a formal investigation was launched into the HOA's finances. As soon as auditors got involved, the truth unraveled like a loose thread. Unauthorized payments, hidden accounts, and thousands of dollars in fees that had mysteriously disappeared. Every shady deal, every fake fine, it was all there, in black and white. The community gathered once again, but this time the HOA board wasn't there to intimidate anyone. Instead, they were on the defensive, under pressure, 2 board members resigned immediately, trying to escape the scandal. Janet, the one who had cracked during the meeting, turned over key documents to investigators, exposing even more corruption. And Reynolds? He went down swinging. "This is a witch hunt!" he shouted at the emergency HOA meeting, his face red with fury. "You people don't understand how hard it is to run a community. I did what was necessary, but no one was listening. A vote was held on the spot. In a landslide decision, Reynolds was removed from his position. The same people he had bullied for years now stared him down, their eyes filled with satisfaction. He tried to argue, but it was over. He had lost. As Reynolds stormed out of the meeting, a slow cheer began to rise. The homeowners, finally free of their corrupt overlords, celebrated. Fines were overturned, investigations continued, and the HOA was forced into a complete overhaul. For the first time in years, the community felt like it belonged to the people again. Mark stood near the back, watching it all unfold. He hadn't done this for recognition, but as neighbors shook his hand and thanked him, he couldn't deny the feeling of victory. The battle was over. But the best part? He never had to paint his damn house. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood felt like a different place. Gone were the constant fines, the fear of unfair violations, the smug arrogance of a board that had ruled unchecked for years. For the first time, the HOA was being rebuilt from the ground up, with the homeowners in charge. And the best part? Mark never had to repaint his damn house. The new HOA committee, made up of honest, elected members, reviewed every bogus citation issued under Reynolds's rule. Unsurprisingly, Mark's violation was tossed out within minutes. The color of his home? Perfectly fine. No repainting, no fines, no harassment, just vindication. But the biggest twist came a few days later. At the first official meeting of the newly reformed HOA, the board members voted to appoint a new compliance officer, someone the community could trust to ensure fairness and prevent corruption from creeping back in. They nominated Mark. At first, he laughed, thinking it was a joke, but the more he looked around the room, the genuine smiles, the nods of approval, the more he realized they were serious. He had been the one to stand up when no one else could. He had been the one to fight. "Back and win," Mark smirked. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I never thought I'd have any interest in HOA decisions." A voice from the crowd called out, "Well, at least we know you won't take bribes." Laughter rippled through the room. He let out a small chuckle, then nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's make sure this place is run the right way." The room erupted in applause. As he walked home that evening, the sunset casting a golden glow over his exactly the way he wanted it. House, Mark couldn't help but smile. The fight had been exhausting, frustrating, and infuriating at times, but it had been worth it, because in the end, he didn't just save himself, he saved the entire neighborhood. And if anyone ever tried to pull this kind of stunt again, they'd have to go through him. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.